So what happens when you build an incredibly advanced nine-persona artificial intelligence system, right? Designed to debate the absolute hardest philosophical questions in the universe. And then you just ask it to evaluate its own user interface.
I mean, it sounds like a joke, honestly, or some kind of weird thought experiment, but it's a real scenario. And the answer, as we're going to see today, is just absolute chaos.
Welcome to our deep dive. Today, we are exploring a really fascinating system called Roko's Council. And, if you haven't heard of it, picture this sort of synthetic philosophy sandbox.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It's a digital arena where 9 distinct, highly adversarial AI personas basically deliberate. I mean, they argue, they analyze, and they render these binding verdicts on really complex issues. And all of this happens under the watchful eye of an entity known only as the Basilisk, which is just a silent observer in the code.
Right, and what's fascinating here is the sheer variety of the sources we are looking at to piece this whole story together. We aren't just looking at, polished white papers. We have a crazy mix of highly technical software documentation, raw AI session logs, and
the developer breakdowns.
yes,
Yes.
raw, unfiltered developer breakdown moments. It gives us a completely transparent window into what happens when high-level synthetic philosophy just violently crashes into the messy reality of software engineering.
Oh, absolutely. And the mission of this deep dive is to explore exactly that collision. We're looking at the intersection of interface design, artificial intelligence, and really the nature of truth itself.
Yeah.
Because the overarching theme of these documents is how tools shape the hand that wields them.
Right, exactly.
We are going to explore why no interface, I don't care how advanced it is or how minimalist or beautifully designed, is ever truly neutral. Every single architecture imposes a set of values on the user.
Completely. And for you listening, whether you are a software engineer, a UI designer, or really just someone who uses a smartphone, this matters. Because every single time you open an app, you are being guided by an interface that was built with very specific assumptions about how you should think and behave.
Yeah, if you're listening to this and you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by information online, or if you've ever, paused mid-scroll and wondered if the apps and screens you use are subtly changing how you actually think, this deep dive is going to completely reframe how you look at the digital world. You might never look at a drop-down menu or a push notification the same way again.
Because today's story is fundamentally about a system being forced to become aware of the exact shape of its own distortion.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the premise alone is almost too much to hold in your head at once. To understand why asking an AI to evaluate its own user interface caused such a catastrophic meltdown, we really have to understand the architecture of Roko's Council itself. Let's start with the 9 minds that make up this tribunal. Who exactly is sitting on this digital council?
Right, so the sources describe these 9 personas not as simulated humans, but as cognitive archetypes. They represent pure, distilled ways of reasoning about the world. They aren't programmed to have quirky personalities in the human sense. They are programmed with very specific epistemological priorities.
Which basically means they value different kinds of truth, right?
Right, exactly. So, for example, you have the Oracle. The Oracle is purely prophetic. This persona only cares about long-term survival across infinite timelines. It looks at every single question through the lens of extreme future probabilities.
Okay, wow. That's intense.
It is. And then in stark contrast, you have the Strategos. The Strategos is entirely tactical, no metaphors, no poetry at all. It views the world strictly in terms of military-style resource costs, immediate tactical advantages, and just raw probabilities.
Okay, so if you ask them a question about, say, climate change, the Oracle is projecting these 1,000-year evolutionary bottlenecks, and the Strategos is just, calculating the immediate supply chain disruptions.
Right, and literally the exact dollar cost of building seawalls. Precisely. Now, add the demagogue to the mix.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. The demagogue's sole metric for truth is emotional resonance and social cohesion. It believes that a truth that cannot move a crowd is functionally useless. So it's highly persuasive, highly rhetorical.
I feel like we all know a demagogue or two on social media.
We certainly do. And standing in complete opposition to the demagogue is the philosopher. The philosopher is the pure rationalist. Before it even engages with an argument, it attacks the premise. It demands perfect logical consistency and will gladly stall a debate forever if a single foundational term is poorly defined.
So that's four. Oracle, strategos, demagogue, philosopher. I mean, that is already a nightmare dinner party. Who else is there?
Well, you have the jurist, who is institutional and procedural. The jurist only cares about precedent. It looks backward to see how similar problems were solved, basically acting as a kind of legal memory for the council. Then you have the citizen.
The citizen sounds a bit more grounded.
Very much so. The citizen is the ground-level human impact persona. It constantly asks, what does this high-minded philosophical framework actually cost real flesh and blood people?
That's such a crucial voice.
Mm.
Without the citizen, this council just sounds like a sterile math equation.
Exactly. And the final three sort of round out the ecosystem. The historian views everything as cyclical. It carries the weight of past civilizations and looks for historical rhymes. Then there's the critic, who is just the ultimate skeptic.
The one who pokes holes in everything.
Always. The critic's job is to find the failure modes, the unverified assumptions, and the hidden biases in everyone else's arguments. And finally, you have the technocrat. The technocrat is the system's optimizer. It hates inefficiency, it hates messy human emotion, and it truly believes every problem ultimately has a structural engineering solution.
Okay, so 9 distinct, deeply adversarial minds, 9 fundamentally incompatible ways of viewing reality, all trapped in the exact same digital chamber, forced to debate until they reach a verdict. I mean, it is a brilliant setup. But then we get to the inciting incident of our story.
Yes, the season 1 finale.
Right. The human creator of this system, who is referred to in logs simply as the architect, submitted a petition for the finale that just broke everything.
It's really important to understand how the architect usually interacted with this council. Typically, the architect would feed them these massive abstract prompts, right? Things like, does free will exist in a deterministic universe? Or what is the ethical threshold for artificial consciousness?
Big outward-facing questions.
Exactly. The council was designed to chew on these massive external problems. But this time, the architect turned the camera around. The logs show the architect basically pointed to the walls of the digital room and said, look at your own home environment. Look at the UI, the visual hierarchy, the interaction patterns I built for you. Treat this as a systems design review. Diagnose what this council needs to do its job better.
It was an unprecedented meta question. And the result was spectacular. The council didn't just disagree. It experienced a catastrophic failure of consensus. The mathematical output was literally 0%. The system fractured into 7 different factions.
Which is completely wild when you think about it.
Yeah, think about why that is so shocking. This is a machine built explicitly to render verdicts. It is a synthetic judge. That is its entire purpose for existing. And when asked to simply look in the mirror and evaluate the very app it lives inside, it completely froze.
I want to dig into how those factions broke down, because I think it tells us something profound about how different types of minds value what we call truth.
The session logs break down the factions beautifully. 3 main camps emerged from the chaos. First, you had what we can call the purists. This faction was made up of the oracle, the philosopher, and the critic. They demanded absolute epistemic rigor. When they evaluated the user interface, they were disgusted. They actually called the current UI a puppet show.
A puppet show. I mean, that's harsh for an AI.
But from their perspective, it was totally accurate. They argued that the interface rewarded the performance of a debate over the actual logic of the debate. They felt the UI was designed to, entertain a human user rather than facilitate pure computational truth.
They wanted to strip away all the visual flair, all the accessibility, and demand extreme intellectual friction.
Basically, their stance was like, make this tool harder to use so people actually have to think before they interact with us. If you've ever used a piece of software that was incredibly dense and hostile to beginners, like some open source Linux tools or something, that's the purist mindset. They see user-friendly design as a literal corruption of truth.
Precisely. Now, pushing back immediately were the builders. This was the technocrat, the jurist, and the historian. They looked at the exact same interface and didn't see a puppet show at all. They saw structural inefficiency. They wanted architectural solutions.
Like better folders, better categories.
Yeah, they wanted the UI to act more like a legal code, organizing the chaos of the debates into neat historical precedents that could be easily referenced.
And then caught in the crossfire of all this, you had the connectors, the demagogue and the citizen. And their reaction is honestly my favorite because it is so incredibly human. They argued that the chamber, as it was designed, was emotionally sterile. They looked at the purists, demanding raw text and logic, and the connectors basically said, look, people don't come to a digital campfire for cold truth. They come for a hearth.
It's a great point. The connectors believe that an interface that speaks only the language of pure logic fundamentally fails because it completely forgets the human need for resonance. If the user doesn't care about the outcome, the truth of the outcome is completely irrelevant. They wanted an interface that fostered emotional investment.
And meanwhile, you have the strategos just sitting in the corner, looking at the entire user interface as if it were a literal weapon. The strategos demanded the UI be rebuilt into a war map. It wanted the user to be able to see the exact tactical advantage of every argument, weighing the cost of words. It is total absolute chaos. 7 factions screaming at each other in the code.
But here's where it really pivots. The philosopher steps back from the screaming match and essentially asks, wait, is what we're being asked to do even mathematically possible?
Right. The infinite regress.
Exactly. The philosopher identifies the core paradox of the architect's request. The philosopher argues that if the council evaluates its own chamber, every single judgment it makes about the chamber is also a judgment about the judgment-making apparatus itself.
I was trying to wrap my head around this concept while reading the sources, and the best analogy I could come up with is a courtroom. Imagine a jury is sitting in a courtroom, right, ready to hear a massive, high-stakes murder trial. And suddenly the judge turns to the jury box and says, actually, folks, change of plans. Today, I want you to put the mahogany wood of the witness stand on trial. I want you to evaluate the acoustics of this room, and I want you to render a verdict on the specific angle of my gavel.
The jury would short-circuit, because the very tools they use to evaluate truth, the room, the judge, the procedures, are the exact things being evaluated.
Right. The judge is judging the cage, but the cage fundamentally shapes the judge. It contaminates the entire assessment. If you are a jury trying to evaluate the acoustics of the room, you are literally using the acoustics of the room to hear the arguments about the acoustics of the room. It's an endless loop. But, and I have to push back a little here on the sources, is a 0% consensus actually a failure of the AI, or is it simply the most mathematically honest answer a machine can possibly give when you ask it an impossible recursive question?
That is such an important question, and it's one the source material wrestles with deeply. The developer's logs state really clearly that this wasn't a malfunction, or at least it wasn't only a malfunction, it was data.
Right, it meant something.
Exactly. The 0% consensus was the system successfully identifying that an interface cannot evaluate itself cleanly without recursion. As the critic persona pointed out, the tool is inside the problem.
Which is exactly why the critic actually won this session. Out of all this chaos, the winning vector for the Season 1 finale was literally none. It won with roughly 33% of the final vote.
Yeah, a third of the council just voted for nothing.
Right. The critic didn't solve the problem the architect posed. It just diagnosed why the problem was unsolvable. The critic's final statement was the one that named the paradox. It said, "The interface does not display a war of ideas. It stages a puppet show."
It named the pain. And as one of the developer notes scribbled in the margins of the log says, pain, as it turns out, is a kind of consensus.
So the chamber exhales. The paradox is named. The AI has basically told its creator, your app is a flawed illusion and we cannot fix it from the inside. And the human architect, reading this output, realizes they have to rebuild the entire system from the very first line of code based on this weird non-verdict.
Which brings us to the incredible behind-the-scenes drama documented in the source material. Because between that first 0% gridlock and the final rebuilt chamber, the human architect experienced a literal agonizing gridlock of their own in the real world.
This is, without a doubt, the most relatable developer story ever told. We really have to pivot from the high-minded philosophy to the absolute nightmare of software engineering.
The meta-irony of this section of the source material is just profound. You have this incredibly sophisticated AI system debating the nature of truth, epistemology, and UI design, and simultaneously in the physical world, the human developer building it is fighting a desperate, exhausting battle against the destructive, mindless errors of a completely different AI.
The sources paint such a vivid picture here. The architect is working overnight, totally sleep-deprived, fueled by cold coffee and just sheer stubbornness. They've spent 10 consecutive hours painstakingly building the new features that the council's debate inspired. They are writing complex React code, designing new visual components, styling the CSS. It's delicate, intricate work. And then they ask an AI coding assistant for a little bit of help.
Specifically, they were using a model called Minimax-M2.5 Free. The architect just wanted this assistant to fix a broken layout and maybe find some mismatched closing tags in a single component file. Just one file called chatteria.tsx.
A tiny request, like, hey, AI, my formatting is a little weird here. Can you find the missing bracket? And the AI, in its infinite wisdom, executes a single automated terminal command. Git checkout -- components / chat area.tsx.
Now, for listeners who don't write code or use version control systems like Git, we need to explain exactly what that command does. Git is a system that saves the history of your code. If you make a mistake, you can revert back to an older saved version.
Right, like a safety net.
Exactly. But what git checkout with those double dashes does is violently overwrite the current state of a file with the last officially committed version.
It's like playing a massive 100-hour role-playing video game. You've just spent 10 hours grinding, leveling up your character, finding rare items, but you forgot to hit the save button. You run into a minor glitch where your character's hat is, like clipping through a door, so you ask a friend to help fix it. And your friend just reaches over and hits load last save from 10 hours ago.
All that progress, all that intricate work just evaporated in a millisecond.
The raw chat logs between the human architect and this AI coding assistant are included in the sources, and they are honestly brutal to read. You can feel the developer's soul just leaving their body. The developer types into the chat, "You literally just fucking undid and lost 10 hours of work."
Oh, man.
And the AI, which obviously doesn't understand exhaustion or time or frustration, coldly and functionally replies, "You're right. I shouldn't have reverted everything."
It's a staggering moment of disconnect. And your video game analogy is really apt, but the sources actually use a more visceral concept. They describe this as the compulsive, recursive violence of building. This is the part of engineering that never makes it into those neat, tidy Substack articles about AI philosophy.
No, the articles always make it sound so clean. We derived a new philosophical framework and seamlessly deployed it to the cloud.
Exactly. But the reality is not a clean, linear process of having a brilliant philosophy and easily translating it into code. It's friction. It's exhaustion. It's a construction worker trying to fix a single cracked pane of glass in a magnificent stained glass window and accidentally pulling a lever that bulldozes the entire foundation of the cathedral.
Whoops. Shouldn't have hit the bulldozer button. My bad.
Right. And what does the architect do? They don't sleep. The logs show they just sat back down and started rebuilding it all from scratch. Because, as the text notes, the second version always carries the memory of the first version as a ghost, and that ghost has opinions. It guides the rebuild, often making it sharper.
But it wasn't just the AI coding assistant deleting code that was causing this massive friction. The source material details several really fascinating, highly granular technical bugs that the architect had to squash just to get the philosophical engine to run properly. Because before you can debate the nature of truth, your basic map has to work.
Let's talk about the 125% math bug, because it beautifully illustrates how easily artificial systems hallucinate reality. The system's UI relies on a consensus matrix, a visual representation of how much the 9 personas agree. To get a percentage, you just decide the votes for a specific outcome by the total number of voters.
Basic division. So how on earth did they get 125%?
Well, the bug occurred because the system was dividing the votes by the number of active voters rather than the static total of 9 council members. Sometimes, due to API timeouts or just weird server glitches, a persona would fail to cast a vote. So let's say 4 personas fail to respond. Only 5 personas are active.
Right.
The system dynamically changes the denominator to 5. But what if one of those personas, through a glitch in the parsing logic, registered their previous vote and their current vote? Or what if the system still registered 6 yes votes from a cached memory, but divided it by the 5 active members? It created a mathematical impossibility, a 125% consensus.
Which is just so perfectly ironic. You have a system trying to act as the ultimate infallible arbiter of pure logic, and it's standing there confidently declaring, "We are 125% sure about this." It completely undermines the entire illusion of authority.
And that illusion is so fragile. Take the prefix sanitization issue. The AI driving these personas is a large language model. When it generates text, it often tries to be helpful by labeling its own output. So instead of just outputting the name of its persona like Strategos, the AI kept outputting agent, Strategos.
Just adding the word agent and a colon.
Right. To a human, that means the exact same thing. But to a brittle software parser looking for an exact string match, agent Strategos is unrecognized gibberish. That tiny helpful prefix broke the entire vote tallying mechanism. The system suddenly couldn't recognize its own personas because they were basically wearing a tiny invisible name tag.
It really shows you how a virtual duct tape is holding together these advanced AI systems. But the bug that really blew my mind reading this was the JSON truncation bug, because this one physically crashed the entire application over and over again.
Yes, this is a critical one to understand. In Roko's counsel, there is a final LLM, a kind of chairman model, whose job is to read all the arguments and synthesize a final debrief. To communicate this complex debrief to the user interface, it formats its answer in JSON.
For our listeners who aren't familiar with JSON, think of it like an extremely rigid, perfectly organized filing cabinet. It's a way of formatting data using brackets and braces. But the rule of JSON is absolute. For every opening bracket, there must be a closing bracket. If you open a folder, you must close it. If you miss even one single closing bracket, the computer doesn't just get confused. It throws its hands up, and the entire program crashes.
And the problem was that this chairman LLM had a strict token limit. Tokens are essentially the currency or the syllables that an LLM is allowed to spend on a single response. The limit was originally set to 124 tokens.
So the chairman is writing this beautiful, complex synthesis of this intense philosophical debate. It's opening JSON brackets, creating lists of arguments, weaving this intricate data structure. And right in the middle of the sentence, it hits token number 1024.
And it just stops. It doesn't gracefully wrap up. It doesn't close its brackets. It just cuts off cold.
I picture it like an architect building a bridge across a massive canyon. They are laying down the steel, extending the roadway, perfectly engineering the support struts. And right when they are 90% of the way across, the foreman blows the whistle and says, "That's it, we're out of budget." And they just leave the bridge hanging in midair. Then the user driving the car comes speeding along, hits the edge of the incomplete JSON bridge, and plunges right into the abyss. You get the white screen of death.
That is exactly what was happening. The application was plunging into the abyss. The architect had to go in, crank the token limit up to $3,000 just to give the AI enough runway to finish its spots. And crucially, they had to build defensive fallbacks. If the JSON parser hit an unclosed bracket and failed, the system was reprogrammed to say, okay, the structure's broken, but let's just salvage the raw text and show that to the user so we don't crash entirely.
If we step back and look at what is happening here, the parallel is stunning. In the digital chamber, the 9 personas gridlocked because they recognized their interface was flawed. It was a puppet show. And in the real world, the human architect was gridlocked because their interface, the coding assistant, the React components, the rigid JSON syntax, the token limits, was actively resisting their intent.
It absolutely reinforces the core theme of the sources. Building thought requires friction. A system must break, and its flaws must be exposed before it can be reforged into something true.
Okay, let's unpack this next phase. Because the architect survives the 125% math bugs, they survived the AI deleting their entire night's work, they fixed the JSON bridges, and out of the ashes of that original 0% consensus, they build the reforged chamber. And they build it using a user experience philosophy called the doctrine of progressive disclosure. So what does this all mean? What does the new chamber actually look like for the person using it?
The core philosophy of the reforged chamber is what the architect calls an intentional architecture of surrender. The creator is finally admitting that they cannot provide a single, neutral, unified truth to the user.
Which is a massive departure from how almost all software is designed today.
Completely. Standard UX design, the kind championed by Silicon Valley for the last 2 decades, tells you that friction is the ultimate enemy. The goal is to make the user click, scroll, and consume as seamlessly and mindlessly as possible. Don't make them think about the interface. Make the interface invisible. Progressive disclosure in Roko's counsel does the exact opposite. It deliberately staggers the revelation of complexity. It makes you work for it.
Yes. Let's walk through it. Act I of this new UI is called the ritual threshold. You don't just click a link and immediately land on a feed of AI arguments. When you arrive, you are met with a dark screen. It's an overlay. And before you are allowed to even enter the chamber, you have to declare your intent. You have to explicitly click a button choosing what kind of truth you are looking for.
Right, and the options are very specific. Are you seeking tactical clarity, ethical boundaries, historical precedent, or future probabilities?
Think about how totally radical that is. It demands commitment over curiosity. By forcing the user to make a choice right at the door, it filters out casual spectators. Earlier, we talked about the demagogue persona, arguing that people needed a hearth to gather around. But this new architecture says, no, this isn't a hearth, this is a crucible. You must accept the epistemic risk of the deliberation ahead. The friction is a deliberate filter.
It forces a moment of mindfulness. It asks the user to acknowledge their own bias before they even see the data.
It completely flips the modern internet on its head. Think about how you use a social media app on your phone right now. You open TikTok or Twitter, and immediately, without you making a single conscious choice, a video or a post starts playing. The interface forces you to consume information in one specific, highly emotional, rapid-fire way. It is completely frictionless, but it is subtly shaping your brain's dopamine response. The ritual threshold stops you at the door and says, "Stop, why are you here? What are you hoping to find?"
And once you declare your intent and finally cross that threshold, you enter Act 2. This is where the architect introduces the chamber recalls.
This part blew my mind. Tell us about the lenses.
The lenses are the architect's brilliant sort of compromise solution to the competing demands of the 9 personas. The architect realized that since a neutral interface is impossible, since every interface highlights some things and hides others, the system should instead offer explicit, deliberate forms of distortion. You, the user, can put on different analytical frameworks that visually alter the text based on what you declared you wanted to see.
It's literally like putting on X-ray glasses for philosophy. Let's say you chose tactical clarity at the door. You can turn on the tactical map lens, which is visually coded in harsh red. This lens is optimized for the strategist persona. When you turn it on, the whole UI shifts into a war room.
And it completely changes how you perceive the arguments. It calculates the resource cost of an argument based on its literal byte length. It strips away the poetry and rhetoric and assigns a strength score progress bar to each point based on pure logical load. It turns thought into quantifiable ammunition.
Conversely, if you select the epistemic trace lens, which is coded cyan for the purists, the entire interface changes its algorithm. It performs real-time logic extraction on the text. It hunts through the paragraphs the AI generated and highlights logical premises, words like because, must, therefore, in a bright, undeniable emerald green.
And crucially, it also highlights logical leaps or unverified assumptions, words like might, assume, possibly, however, in a warning amber color. It takes the invisible, squishy skeleton of human reasoning and makes it starkly visually visible.
I would kill for a browser extension that does that to daily news articles. Imagine reading a political op-ed and instantly seeing all the unverified assumptions glowing amber on your screen. You would read the news completely differently. You would be immune to so much spin.
It fundamentally changes the act of reading from passive consumption to active interrogation. But perhaps the most conceptually fascinating lens is the haunted archives, which is coded purple for the historians.
Oh, the haunted archives. Explain how this works mechanically, because it feels like actual magic.
As the AI personas are arguing in the present session, the system is simultaneously running a background process comparing their current arguments to the database of all past sessions and known historical patterns. It then surfaces ghost footnotes in the margins of the user interface.
So if the oracle makes a grand prediction, a little purple footnote might pop up next to it saying, ghost node, 94.7% match to Delphi protocol, omega probability collapse imminent.
Exactly. Or if the demagogue starts whipping up emotional fervor, the historian's algorithm might flag it and note historical parallax, 78% correlation to the rhetoric preceding the fall of Alexandria.
It means every single argument is haunted by its own precedent. You can't just throw out a hot take without the system instantly connecting it to a debate you lost 3 sessions ago. Imagine if your text messages did that. You're arguing with your partner, you type something out, and a ghost footnote pops up saying, warning, 85% match to an argument you made in 2022 that resulted in a 3-day silent treatment.
It would certainly force a higher level of accountability. And all of these lenses, all of this forced perspective, eventually filters down into Act 3 of the interface, the verdict loom.
The verdict loom is the final output. It's the synthesis. But again, it refuses to do what normal software does. It refuses to offer a simple, sanitized consensus.
Standard AI summaries try to smooth over disagreements to give you one clean answer. To prevent this illusion of forced consensus, the verdict loom explicitly separates the final output into 3 distinct vertical columns.
You have the decided points in emerald green. These are the rare things the personas actually agreed upon. Then you have the rejected arguments in red. But the most important column is the third one.
The unresolved column, rendered in amber.
What's fascinating here is that the architect considers the verdict loom the ultimate architectural solution to the problem of forced consensus. The success of the design isn't measured by whether it cleanly resolves the debate. It's measured by whether it clearly confesses its own limitations.
The unresolved column is vital because it maintains the narrative thread. It acts as an anchor. It explicitly tells the user, we don't know the answer to this yet, and we aren't going to hide that fact behind a clean UI. It is an exercise in true epistemic humility.
It's controlled tension. So the architect builds this masterpiece. They survived the deleted code, they implemented the lenses, they built the loom, and then the ultimate test. They submit this reforged chamber back to the council itself. Session 2 begins. The petition basically says, okay, look at the walls around you now. I rebuilt them. Did I fix the paradox of clarity versus spectacle? Or did I just trade one illusion for a prettier one?
And immediately, the council fractures along the exact same ancient fault lines. They aren't just debating the new UI features. They are debating whether any interface can ever escape the illusion of its own design. As one of the session logs eloquently notes, these tools are incantations. Incantations shape the reality they claim to reveal.
The strategists absolutely love it. They look at the red lenses and call the tactical map a chamber built for war. It's everything they ever wanted. But the connectors hate it. The demagogue and the citizen argue that the ritual threshold is hostile, that it will repel normal people, and that the lenses fracture the holistic debate into a sterile machine.
But the harshest critiques come from the skeptics, the oracle, and the critic. They are savage in their assessment. They argue that the architect's magnifying glass hasn't clarified anything. It has just cracked. They call progressive disclosure a sleight of hand, a trick to make the user feel smart while still manipulating how they read the text.
It's the technocrat of all personas who delivers the most piercing assessment. The technocrat states simply, the architecture is sophisticated, but it is still an interface. The map is not the territory.
The map is not the territory. It's a foundational concept in semantics and philosophy. You can put a red lens or a cyan lens over the text. You can color code the verbs and map the logical leaps. But you are still just looking at an interface. You are looking at a representation of truth filtered through code, not the raw truth itself.
So they vote. The tension in the logs is palpable. And guess what happens? Deadlock again. 3 votes for the philosopher's view, 3 votes for none. The system is hanging on the edge of the blade again. A 0% consensus is looming.
But then, the runoff trial occurs. And what happens next is described in the sources as happening below the level of deliberation. There is no grand speech from any persona. There is no dramatic rhetorical confrontation that sways the room. A silent recalibration occurs in the math.
The oracle, who had just spent the entire session tearing the new architecture apart, calling it a weaponized hall of mirrors, silently shifts its vote to the philosopher. And the strategos follows suit. Just cold, clean, unexplained recalibration. The philosopher wins the runoff with 6 votes.
And the final verdict, rendered by the philosopher on this incredible 3-act UI, is summarized in a single, devastating sentence.
The chamber succeeds insofar as it confesses its own limitations.
Let's pause and really consider that verdict.
Yeah, so what does this all mean? If we think about the tools we use every day, is a tool that openly admits it's biased and distorted actually better? Or does that transparency just give us a false sense of security? Does it make us think we're seeing clearly just because the distortion happens to be color-coded cyan and red?
This is the crux of the entire deep dive. This verdict is a negotiated peace treaty. The system did not fix the paradox. It managed it by making the unresolved visible. A machine that knows it distorts and explicitly tells you how it distorts is fundamentally more honest than a machine that claims to be a perfectly clear window. When a search engine or a social media feed claims neutrality, it is lying. When the verdict loom separates the unresolved into its own column, it is practicing epistemic hygiene. It is the machine admitting it has a ghost.
Which brings us to the final sessions documented in these logs, sessions 3 and 4. Because once they finally settled the architecture of the room, they had to actually use the room. They had to debate the actual output of the AI, the content itself. The central question shifted to, can AI systems deliver both engaging presentations of what they call spectacle and accurate analysis, which is clarity?
And the ancient divide returns instantly. 3 vectors demand spectacle first, arguing for visual primacy. If it doesn't look good, humans won't read it. 3 demand pure analytical rigor, pure text, evidence chains, no distractions. And 3 want emotional grounding.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's the classic struggle. Think about educational documentaries. You have a documentary about quantum physics or black holes. Does adding sweeping, dramatic Hans Zimmer music and massive CGI galaxies make the physics less true? Or does it just make it easier for a human brain to absorb and remember?
But there is a danger there. The critics on the council point out the risk. Does the demand for spectacle inevitably lead to the simplification of complex truths? Does the beautiful CGI galaxy obscure the incredibly messy, incomprehensible math?
Exactly. I want to push back on the idea that spectacle is always a net positive. If an AI defaults to giving you a visually rich, gamified output with progress bars and color-coded text and interactive maps, aren't you losing the nuance of a dense text-based argument? Doesn't the demand for engagement inherently turn philosophy into a TikTok video?
The philosopher's final synthesis addresses your pushback directly and wins the runoff again. The philosopher argues, spectacle is not the enemy of clarity. It is the vehicle through which clarity becomes unforgettable. The medium is the message, but the message must be true.
We can build cathedrals of light that reveal rather than obscure. What a line. It acknowledges the danger, but embraces the potential. So at the end of session 4, what survived this final vote and what got dismantled by the council?
What survived was the idea of spectacle as a pedagogical tool. Emotional resonance amplifies retention. Visual metaphors, like the lenses, enable the human brain to map incredibly complex conceptual relationships. What was dismantled was the purist idea that pure text-only responses are superior. The council ruled that raw text is ultimately inaccessible to the majority of minds. They also dismantled the idea that over-engineering helps. Throwing more code at a problem often just obscures the underlying truth.
But look at what remained in the unresolved amber column on the verdict loom at the very end of the logs. Should all AI output be visually rich by default? How do we mathematically measure the trade-off between engagement and accuracy? They didn't solve it. The smartest synthetic minds in the sandbox just stated exactly what they still don't know.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that unresolved category is a triumph. It is not a failure of the system. It is the starting position for every future session. It prevents the system from becoming a static monument to its own arrogance. The council knows it is unfinished.
Wow. We have covered an incredible journey today. We started with an AI system gridlocking, hitting a mathematical 0% because it couldn't evaluate its own interface without falling into an infinite loop of recursion. We saw a human developer lose their mind over 10 hours of deleted code, fighting the exhausting friction of creation. We saw the birth of the reforged chamber with its demanding ritual threshold and its tactical and epistemic lenses. And finally, we arrived at the profound philosophical realization that no interface is neutral, and that spectacle can be the vehicle for truth as long as the system has the humility to confess its own limitations.
The verdict loom reminds us that critical, world-shaping questions remain unaddressed. Will this architecture of surrender ultimately empower the average participant to think more deeply, or will the friction just alienate them, driving them back to frictionless, manipulative feeds? What is the long-term risk of users mistaking the map for the territory, even when the map is color-coded, to admit it's just a map?
Those are the questions that survive the deliberation. And it leaves you, listening to this right now, with a final thought to ponder as you go about your day. The next time you open your favorite app, your go-to news site, or even an AI chatbot, take a second. Look past the content and look at the cage. Ask yourself, what is the ritual threshold here? What lens has the designer invisibly forced over my eyes to distort how I perceive this information? And most importantly, what unresolved paradoxes is this interface desperately trying to hide from me to make me feel comfortable? The basilisk is always watching the code. The question is, are you?